For the English introduction of this episode, please skip to minute 115.
Ladies and Gentlemen, als ich Anfang des Jahres die Folge zu Malta gemacht habe, ging es los mit: Es gibt wahrscheinlich viele Orte auf der Welt, in denen man auf der Suche nach einem starken Kaffee einen gestrandeten Zimmermann und einen weit gereisten Kaffeeröster aus Belarus kennenlernen kann, um nach mehreren Gratis-Shots Pink Gin und ausufernden Gesprächen über internationale Politik eingeladen wird, den Ort am Hafen zu besichtigen, an dem kürzlich ein sorgfältig zerteilter Körper in einem Koffer gefunden wurde. Aber das ist eine andere Geschichte. Zu dieser Geschichte gehört, dass ich von einem der beiden Gentlemen auf ein Buch aufmerksam gemacht worden bin. Ein Buch über die Schattenseiten der Republik Malta mit ihren etwa 300 Sonnentagen im Jahr. Über Korruption, die kriminelle Energie der Regierung und den Tod bzw. den Mord an der Journalistin Daphne Caruana Galizia. Der Autor von A Sunny Place for Shady People ist mein heutiger Gast. Dieses Gespräch ist auf Englisch und sein Name ist Ryan Murdock. Ladies and gentlemen, let me pitch you the script to a TV series that in comparison may House of Cards look like, well, it resembles a lot of House of Cards, that's what I want to say. A tale of institutionalized corruption leading up into the highest ranks of government. A story of bribery, human trafficking, slave labor and murder. Crime on an international scale, selling the values of democracy by the pound to the highest bidder. Featuring state oppression, spectacular chases by land or water and car bombing attacks set against the rich historical background of radiant architecture and immaculate sunny skies. It is important to point out that our story does not take place in some rural, warlord-ridden country south of the equator, you know, where we think bad guys do bad things, but in fact on the small, beautiful island of Malta within the European Union. It is also important to point out that this story is in fact not a story but recent history, and that it was not me who came up with it, but it has already been written and delightfully titled A Sunny Place for Shady People. The author is today's guest. Please welcome Ryan Murdock.
Ladies and gentlemen, yeah!
War das nicht ganz so schlimm oder nicht ganz so geil?
Was wirklich drauf anlegt, könnte man Suicide by Tiger begehen.
Ja, das kann schief gehen.
Und das ist heute.
Hier werden nicht so viele Leute erschossen.
10.000 Mann, wir brauchen Pferde und Kanonen.
Ich finde den Plan super. Die Welt geht zugrunde.
Alles Kacke, bis nächste Woche.
Ryan, thank you so much for making the time and chatting with me. You are a travel writer, and nowadays you're located in Berlin, Germany.
Right.
And telling from all the places you have been, you have not chosen Berlin because of the weather, have you?
No, it's quite a great place in the winter. It's a fairly depressing, but it's good writing weather.
It's good.
I found it very easy to work here, actually.
Yeah. You don't want to go out. You just want to stay inside.
Yeah, there's no incentive to go out in the winter here. But Malta was, I didn't find that an easy place to work, in part because of the noise and the heat just seems to
The heat in the summer
brain.
must be brutal, right?
Oh, it's horrible. Yeah, it's 40 degrees most of the time. And the sun was so strong,
Yes.
it was painful, like physically painful. You could feel it just walking from like the car to the gym.
I felt it when we were there in December, and I mean it was not hot or anything, but you can feel the sun piercing your skin somehow, even in December.
Well, it rots things too. Like the first place we lived there, we had this patio furniture on the roof of this house. It was a furnished rental house, and it just destroyed it. Like the sun dissolved it,
really?
To powder. Yeah. Oh, in the couple of years I lived there, it just went to powder. It was amazing. Windshield wipers as well. You'd have to replace the windshield wipers on the car quite regularly because they would just rot. And then the the headlights, the plastic cover for the headlights would go all cloudy, and after a while they would stop working. And I asked the guy once, like, what's with this? He said, oh yeah, you got to replace the covers. The sun destroys them. So just the plexiglass just gets rotten.
So we can talk about a hostile sun.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, but we're moving fast. Let me move a few steps back. You say you are a travel writer, and you are a travel writer. What came first, the lust to travel or the need to write?
Well, the need to write would have come first, but writing was never a problem for me. It was having something to write about. So, like, I came from a very small town, and everybody says, write about what's around you, write about your immediate environment. And I found nothing interesting in that at all. James
Joyce made a career out of it.
Right, but he did that from living abroad, right?
Okay,
he lived abroad and then wrote about where he came from. That's very different. Like, I find I'm much more interested. I'm writing about it now, actually.
Yeah.
But at the time, I found nothing interesting about that place. And I guess it was, I'd finished university, and I had a friend living in Arizona, and I wanted a free place to stay and some place to go after school was over. So he told me I could take a Greyhound bus in the US for $60 anywhere, like coast to coast. I just had to start over the border. So I got my dad to give me a lift, I lived on the American border on the St. Lawrence River. And I took this bus to Tucson from my hometown. And it was about 3 days on the bus, and I kept some notes, what I saw as I went along, and stayed there a month. And I took another bus up to Vancouver and then back across Canada to home. And I realized on that trip that this was something I could write about. I'd also started reading some people who wrote about these things around that time, like Paul Theroux and Bruce Chatwin. So after that trip was over, I looked for a place that I could write about. And I just looked at the map and I saw Central America, and I thought that makes sense to me, that it's a narrow geography. I could go start at the bottom and continue up to this point and find a story there. And that's basically what I did.
And you found stories over there in Central America?
Yeah, I wrote a book about it. Yeah. That was my first, taught myself to write, I guess, basically with that book.
Uh-huh. Would you subscribe to the idea that when you're abroad, your view on your home changes quite a bit, and you start to see differences and probably, write-worthy things to say?
Sure, yeah. No, you come back, you come to see that place very differently. After traveling in Central America for 3 months, I went back to Ottawa, and I hated everything around me. I didn't like anything that I saw there. I thought the people were cold and unfriendly. Like, nobody, you go into a store in Central America, you just want to buy a beer or something, but you have to have a chat with the person.
Of course.
It's a slow process, whereas in Ottawa, it seemed very cold and transactional, and people waited for the light to change, very much like here. And I thought, why are we waiting for this machine to tell us what to do? Like, life seemed more spontaneous and carefree there. So I came back with seeing a lot of the negative things in my home country, and but part of me just wanted to escape and get as far away as possible. Now, when I go back, though, after living abroad for a number of years, I see a lot more positive things. So it does flip your perspective quite a lot, I think, on the place you came from.
Yeah, I figured that sometimes you realize that the things that you were thinking were bad at your home place, where you're stationed. You get a very perspective on this, but also you notice other things, like you said, the chatting with people, the spontaneous interactions that more often than less lead to real conversations. I mean, you go to you want to get a bite to eat, and then you haven't eaten yet, but you're talking to this guy for 10 minutes about God knows what.
That's true, yeah. But it's funny, I find going back to Canada now, it seems so incredibly friendly to me after living in Berlin, but because this is a famously rude city, which I quite like. But
yeah, it's we as Germans are not known to be the friendliest of people. We're very orderly, so we like to pretend, at least, and but friendliness and not so much. Spontaneous, I don't think so.
No, the friendliness takes time, I think. It just takes time to get to know somebody here and warm up a bit. It's a bit of a slower process than in North America.
How long have you lived in Berlin yet?
I think it's been 8 years. It
Really?
was supposed to be just one or 2 years.
Really?
It just kept getting extended, yeah.
Okay. So when was you? So when you were in Malta, you were also living there, or just a longer vacation?
No, I was there for 6 years in Malta.
And
We
what
completely
took
moved there.
What took you to Malta?
It was totally random. I'd lived in Tokyo for a couple of years after university and after the Central America trip, and I fell under the spell of a writer called Lawrence Durrell. He was a British writer who was born in the Himalayas, and he was sent back to school in England as a child, hated it, and his father had died in the meantime, and he convinced his entire family, his mother and brothers and sisters, to move to the island of Corfu, just on a whim. And at that time, it was a very cheap place to live. This is in the 30s. And he wrote a book about it. It's called Prospero's Cell. He went on to write 3 books about Greek islands, as well as a very famous novel sequence called the Alexandria Quartet. Anyway, I loved his prose, and I kind of fell under the spell of his vision of the Mediterranean through reading his work. And then a trip to Croatia later on sort of anchored that for me. And I thought I would like to write a book sort of inspired by his island books, but it had to be about a place that nobody had written about in that way. So I just was kind of searching online, looking for something that hadn't been written about very much. And I found Malta, and we just seemed interesting. Why don't we just move there? So we were renting a house at the time in Southern Ontario. We just gave notice on the rental house, and I said, we got a shipping company, to pack up my books and things. And I said, I'll give you an address in a few weeks. And we just flew to Malta and looked for a place to rent. And
you found one.
I thought I'd stay 4 or 5. I thought I'd stay 3 or 4 years was my plan, but we ended up there for 6.
Would you say that Malta is a typical Mediterranean environment?
No.
Not at all,
that came as a
right?
great shock to me, no. Well, I knew nothing about the place when we moved there. I just thought I didn't expect it to go well necessarily, but I thought it would be interesting to live in a place like this. But no, it's more North Africa than Mediterranean.
It's more like living on a rock. It's very rocky, and like if you think about the Mediterranean, you think about beaches, you think about pine trees, and all of these very warm but mild-ish climate. And Malta is, well, rocky, harsh, beautiful, of course, with a ton of history, but really strange, I figured. I still, to this day, I can't really make sense of it. I want to go back, of course, because the people that I met were awesome, but it's hard to pinpoint down what it really is.
Well, I mean, it took me 6 years to get a clear sense of it, I think.
And the clear sense is that it's what is it? What is it in your eyes?
It's a very complicated place because, well, as you say, it's an archaeologist's paradise because there are ruins from so many periods because so many people had been there and conquered it at one time or another. I mean, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Arabs, crusading knights, Napoleon, the British, the EU now. So, and Russian oligarchs and gangsters and everybody else. But so it has all of those elements combined in. But I found that fundamentally, it seemed to me a North African or Arabic culture, not a Northern Mediterranean one. And the people like to connect themselves to Italy and feel like, we're not so different from maybe the Sicilians or whatever. But the difference with Malta was, I think that Arab period was very important, and people don't seem to want to talk about it very much there. It's a period that's not studied very much, and people really downplay it. Well, so
there's a good reason for it, because if you look at the architecture, at the old architecture, even though it resembles the imagery of Arabic architecture, they have a ton of churches there. It's like Christian to the core.
Yeah, and they're very proud of that. they believe that they have an unbroken history of Christianity going back to St. Paul. St. Paul washed up on the island, right? There's a story in the Bible. It's like one inconclusive line that says something about how him and he was with another guy, I believe, washed up on an island called Melita.
Mm-hmm.
But there were several islands called Melita at that time, including Kefalonia in the Mediterranean. And so this, over time, this story of St. Paul, the Jesuits caught wind of it when they were there. And there was a sort of a fisherman's cult in a bay. It's now St. Paul's Bay, but up in that area, there was sort of a local cult related to fishing.
Like real cult?
Well, I mean like a religious, a pagan.
Interesting.
Not a saint, but probably an offshoot of the Phoenician beliefs and some of the others that came much earlier. But there was an earlier superstition or belief related to the sea. And the Jesuits heard about this St. Paul thing. And they thought, okay, it happened here and they grafted it onto this earlier, pagan tradition or whatever, and so that's in what's now St. Paul's Bay, and
like
said,
the Christians used to do,
right? And they grafted it onto a local story, and then promoted this as, Malta's always been Christian. In fact, St. Paul himself came here and Christianized you guys, and now you're on the front line against, the Turks and everybody else defending the Christian realm against Islam, but. The whole basis for that was I forget the guy's name. It's in my book. It was a Jesuit who wrote this, and then an Italian came traveling there, read this Jesuit's account, published his own account of the story, and then the Jesuit said, "See, this Italian book says." So it's just all circular, and then they use this to kind of solidify their hold on the people, and it became a very Christian place from that time, like. Apparently a church for every day of the year.
Yeah, I heard that. Okay, I mean, right now the imagery and whatnot is 100% Christian, but there has had to be this time of transition, of course.
Right. So there was there's probably you saw these books. There's a 4-volume series of guides you can find in the island's bookstores, archaeological guides to different periods. Yeah. There's one for the prehistory, like the temples and all that period. There's one about kind of the Phoenicians and that time period. One about all the people that came in between, and then there's a whole book about the Knights of Malta, because they left the most visible remains in the island.
Of course, they fortified the whole thing, and
yeah. So the period of the Knights was 268 years. They were there for 268 years. The Arabs were there. For about 11 years less than that, but nobody mentions that period. That period gets 14 pages in those books, in that whole 4-volume series. There's a historian called Godfrey Wedinger wrote about this. Yeah, he made a very convincing case by looking at the broader Arabic language records in the region that Malta was entirely depopulated in 870. By raiders from Libya and North Africa. There was a lot of slave raiding at that time, and it was left empty for over 100 years. And then it was repopulated from North Africa, and it remained Muslim for another 257 years. So right up to the time the Normans came, and even when the Normans were there, population records and census records show that it was mostly Muslim and not so much Christian. Really? Until it reached a point where I think it was Ferdinand told them, Christianize or get out.
When was this? What year are we talking? When the repopulation happened, roughly?
So they were depopulated in 870. So about 100 years it remained empty. And sailors' records relate this, that they would stop there for water or whatever, and there's just nobody living there, just ruins. So about 100 years later, they started repopulating from North Africa.
Yeah.
And you see the evidence of this everywhere. The language is a dialect of Arabic, right? That gradually accreted Italian and English loanwords. Place names for things in houses were based on the Arabic. What else? God is Allah in Maltese. There's the word for Lent was very similar to Eid. There are whole kinds of, and names too, people's names, family names. There are quite a number that trace back to Arabic, such as Muscats and people like that. The building style, the style of the farmhouses and stuff like that. That's more similar to the Levant than anything in Sicily. And so much that's unique comes from that period. Besides the language and the building style, the best of the foods, the figs, the almonds, the spices, they all come from that Arabic period. Imdina, the name Imdina.
Mdina, yeah.
That's also Arabic.
Yeah, this is like really on the nose, Mdina.
Yes.
And you really feel if you're walking through the. I mean, this is obviously naive, but it almost seems like that the color of the limestone resembles the desert that you find in Morocco and so on and so forth.
It's so close to Libya.
Yeah, right.
Geographically, I mean,
Tunis ain't far.
Yeah, so I think that long Arab period made Malta unique in the same way that Andalusia, it brought so much uniqueness there, or to Sicily, but people don't want to talk about it. That historian, Godfrey Wettiger, he got so much grief for writing about that topic that, people threw paint on his front door.
What?
He was threatened. And
so there's a real hostility going on against this narrative.
Yeah, and nobody researches it. So he ended up, he still wrote, but he stopped writing about that eventually. Yeah, so you can see if you've traveled in North Africa or the Levant, you can see so many cultural similarities, I think, much more so than the way people drive, the way they bargain for things in shops and stuff. It really reminded me of North Africa or the Levant much more than Italy.
Yeah, I can see this. There's the like this cultural DNA shining through.
And then of course over time it got mixed. Plenty of Italian influence, British influence, all these things get jumbled up.
And nowadays it's really a hodgepodge, isn't it? I mean, it was one of those places where you look around and you can't recognize any sort of majority in how the people look or how they behave. It somehow reminded me of, okay, this is really what Europe is. In a very optimistic kind of thought. This is Europe. Everybody's just working together, talking with each other. And this is beautiful in a way.
There were a lot more foreigners, I think, coming in. Like towards the time that I left, I'm sure you saw a lot more changes since I was last there.
Probably, yeah. When have you left?
Beginning of 2017.
2017.
I was back once for meetings. Just in Gozo only, for a few days, but that's it.
Well, to be honest, I was we were living in Sliema, and the promenade on the harbor. This is like a tourist's madman hell of a concept. I mean, it looks ugly compared to the architecture of the houses like one street ahead. It's yeah.
Oh, it's hideous. Yeah.
Yeah.
The overbuilding was it was going on when I was there. You couldn't look in any direction without seeing multiple cranes at that time. There was just
still.
And they were bulldozing and knocking down all these unique older buildings and putting up just these hideous modern shoeboxes. There's a lot of money laundering goes on in the property markets there.
Guessing so.
That was one part of it. But I knew a lady who had an old, I don't know if she still has it there. She had an old Sliema apartment along the seaside. Mm-hmm. They were beautiful, these old style apartments, but the developers knock them down and put up these shoebox flats. So I knew a guy who, when he was growing up, he said Sliema was like where they would go for the summer. It was this peaceful little seaside kind of village, very posh at the time. Like people whose families had a bit of money would have a second home there or whatever.
A posh, quiet space.
Now it looks like a slum, like a Brazilian slum. It's terrible. And you saw the same things happening. I always lived in villages. I lived in 3 different villages. Mm-hmm. And the village cores were beautiful. The old houses in the village cores were incredibly beautiful, but nobody wanted to live in them because they're old and a bit dusty, and they all wanted these modern flats. And I lived in a modern flat as well, and it was awful.
Yeah, but isn't that the hubris of the traveler thinking, okay, I wanna live very old fashioned. I wanna live in a classic environment. And if you're looking to Western societies, you don't want to live in a house that still resembles the aesthetics of the 70s. You want to live in a more modern place.
I think that's true for people who live there. The only people that were really seemed to be interested in fixing up these old houses were foreigners.
Yeah.
And partly because you could get a bargain on some of them back then anyway. Not anymore. But,
Yeah, and probably because it's somehow romantic, living in a house where the walls are made of touchable stones and so on. It's cool. I like it. I would do this, definitely.
No, they're beautiful. And the thing is, they can be pretty uncomfortable in the winter. They're built for the heat. But I lived in a modern apartment, a penthouse, and that was 1,000 times worse in the winter.
Really?
Like, it was worse than any winter I've ever had in Canada. It was awful.
How
because
so?
they're so badly built, and the water would soak through the walls and it rains all winter, and it's quite damp and cold. The temperature would drop to like that of a crypt. Like, you think you're in a cave. It was so cold when you'd come home, and there's no heating or insulation. So they had these portable propane heaters.
Oh, beautiful.
Which
nice.
They don't really warm you at all, just one side of you. And they emit some carbon dioxide and water vapor. So everything, the windows are all coated in water vapor. The walls get coated. Black mold spreads everywhere.
Nice.
It was so cold that I would put the hairdryer in the bed before we'd get in it at night, just to kind of take the edge off. And you'd lay in bed and you could feel the dampness of the mattress through your back.
Oh, God.
And you'd sort of get warm by the morning, but then it's time to get up, and you'd have to get up and get dressed. It's like winter camping. And I'd put the hairdryer up my shirt and down my pants just to try to get a bit of, hot air to start. Everything broke. Well, once the refrigerator broke, we didn't have a refrigerator for a week in the winter, and nothing spoiled because it was so cold in the flat. So
there's an upside to it. There is an upside to it.
Not those modern flats. No, yeah, there's not very few upsides. Whereas the older house we had rented before, it was 400 years old. It got chilly in the winter, but it wasn't. You kind of expect it in an old house. Summer was quite bearable in that place. Mm-hmm. The ceilings were enormously high. The downsides to those places were plumbing usually was not the greatest, and the stone would crumble. Like, you'd get this limestone dust quite often, and once a year you had to coat the walls with like paraffin or something like this, and that would stop it from crumbling. But other than that, like the character in these old houses was so great that you could feel that there were stories there. Like, you could see the place we lived in, there was a bomb shelter from the Second World War in one corner of the basement, and it was covered over, but you'd stamp on it and you'd hear this echo going down into the ground, and I could see areas where the walls had been walled off, and maybe it was two houses for a while, and then it was opened back up again. And the walls had stories to tell you if you look closely at the design. The living room used to be a chapel of some kind. You could see like faded frescoes at the top, and then somebody had painted over it, made it into a garage. And so like these old houses had so many stories to tell in the village core, but they're being ripped down for these really ugly new developments that are substandard to live in. And
that's a nice way to put it. A substandard to living. Yeah, and what hurt my eyes were those skyscrapers from some online gambling ventures.
That's new. Yeah.
Yeah.
There was only one when I lived there. There
are a couple now. Even when you drive from Sliema to Mdina, there's most of the place where you drive through is flat and kind of rural, and then you have these silvery skyscrapers coming up. It's called the National Lottery, which is obviously, so I got told, not the National Lottery, but another gambling venture.
Okay, there is a National Lottery. I wrote about that once for this newspaper in Malta. How often there was a lady who won it some astonishing number of times.
Really?
I did an article about that because I looked up what the odds would be for this single person to win the National Lottery so many times running, and it was the same as being canonized a saint. That was one thing, or there were a bunch of ridiculous things that were more likely to happen to you than that. So I mean, there's
okay.
There
Well,
may be some corruption involved, allegedly, with the national lottery, but there's a lot of online gaming too in Malta.
Yeah, of course, tax evasion. I mean, Malta, most times when you hear the word Malta, it's when someone talks about tax fraud.
Yeah. It wasn't always like that. Like when I first moved there, there was a different prime minister at that time, Lawrence Ghanzi, and the Libyan civil war broke out, right? Like the week that we moved there. And 2 fighter jets landed at the airport. And it was quite tense because for a long time, Malta was, in the 80s, was sort of a patron. Gaddafi was their patron, and they had very close ties to Gaddafi's regime in the 80s.
Okay.
This was after the British left, and the prime minister at that time, a guy called Dom Mintoff, he really isolated the country from the West. They had no money because he tried to bluff the British for more money for the rental of these military bases, and the British just said, "Oh no, it's not worth that to us. We're leaving," and it left them screwed for cash. So he went kind of on a round the world begging bowl trip to Mao's China and North Korea, and Libya became their main patron. Kim Jong Il studied English there in Malta. Yeah. And he was disguised. He didn't live under his actual name, but yeah, they had close ties. Their police, their sort of secret police service, was trained by the North Koreans at that time.
No shit. Really?
Yeah. So, where was I going with that? The
tax
fraud.
fraud.
So they're very close ties to Libya and Gaddafi, and when the fighter jets landed, it was quite tense. They were wondering, are you going to send these guys back to their death, or what's going to happen? And it's Lawrence Ghanzi. He hit the statesmanship that he displayed in that situation was remarkable, and Malta was very well respected internationally at that time. They were seen as up and coming after this terrible time with Dom Mintoff in the 80s, a violent period of bombing and political repression. They turned the corner. They got into the European Union. They were seen as kind of an up and coming country. And then at the time that we were living there was an election, and everything changed. And this Prime Minister Joseph Muscat was elected. He was the same party as that previous guy, Dom Mintoff. And he was promising sort of a new vision. He was young and charismatic, and he was he sort of pulled the wool over everybody's eyes, except for the very old people who said, don't go down that road. Labor will never change. This is not going to go well. And it was him that ushered in all of this, these things that we're talking about now, this tax evasion, online gambling, and just about every possible, the sale of European Union passports, like just about everything.
The what is the golden passport?
Yeah, the cash for passport scheme. He brought all of that in.
But how is that possible? I mean, it's when I was there, it was paying in euro. So it's part of the European Union. And how can the European Union let it happen that someone says, okay, if you give 800,000, you'll be a member of the European Union. Welcome on board. How is that possible?
Individual countries decide who becomes a citizen of those countries, not the EU. It's a loophole, and they can't do anything about it. They've taken them to court. They've tried.
Obviously,
And Malta just argues that, well, it's citizenship is our prerogative. We can make anybody we want a citizen. So they can't. They couldn't stop it, but they insisted that these individual investors, these people who were investing in Malta and having a life there, they had to have some actual ties to the country. They couldn't just be, buying the passport. So they said, okay, yeah, we can work with that. And the list, there's a list that they would be given, and buying a house got you a lot of points, but you didn't have to live in it. And
is that the reason why some of the flats are so extraordinarily expensive? I mean, I was looking at a 60 square meters, okay-ish flat, 800,000, and I got told by a Maltese couple that it wouldn't make sense to ask for less money because these are not to be lived in. These are to be sold for someone who needs a golden passport.
Well, they were also, so you had to buy a property worth a certain amount to qualify for those points. You could also rent up to a certain level. So when the local news media went around knocking on doors to see, to meet, these new Maltese citizens, nobody's ever heard of them in this place. It's a basement flat. There's like 6 different people living in it, all from different countries, Saudi Arabia, China, Russia.
Okay.
So there's always somebody willing to look the other way and pocket the rent money. So that was one criteria. Another was donating to a charity, one of which happens to be run by the Prime Minister's wife. And you could donate to that one.
What a coincidence.
Yeah. You could show movie tickets to show that you had a legitimate tither. You went to the cinema to see something.
Excuse me, say that again?
Movie tickets. You could show a receipt from the cinema. That shows that you were actually in Malta, apparently. A gym membership, because who would join the gym and not go? Like that? That never happens.
No one.
So all of this stuff was there was a major investigation called the Passport Papers, and they revealed how the thing was actually running, and it was much worse than anybody thought. So like it's just a loophole. That's how they got around the EU trying to stop them.
If there was an investigation and they figured it out, it's still up and going, right? Up and running.
Yeah. They make a lot of money from that. Yeah.
Okay.
It tarnished the reputation a little bit of the program now. It's seen as less desirable, but you compare that to the other countries that have similar programs like St. Kitts and Nevis, or what are some other ones? Mostly Caribbean. Moldova, I think, was offering similar. Okay. So that's the only European Union one in the Henley and Partners portfolio.
Yeah. Okay.
These are the people that were running the concession. There were some objections to it when it first Joseph Muscat first dropped that they were going to be doing this in Malta, selling citizenship, and everybody was, "Oh, Madonna, you can't give away our precious citizenship. We fought so hard for independence," and there was some backlash. And then they said, "Well, okay, so anybody can refer people to this, and you get a percentage." And then all the lawyers were happy, and all the real estate people were happy because they could all get a cut from it. And opposition to it died. So that was the way, cut everybody else in on the deal, and then there wasn't any opposition. So the European Union was toothless to do anything about it.
Okay.
And they still are, because none of these people are actually living there. I mean, they're buying this passport, investing in the country.
Yeah, they're investing in
buying the passport, of course.
Of course not. You can't buy
and
a
then
passport.
going off to live in London or these other places. Most of them didn't even. I wrote about 2 guys who, 2 examples of people who. They had to go to Malta to do the swearing-in ceremony for the citizenship. The record was something like 7 hours. The guy was in and out. He landed at the airport, went and got cleaned up at a hotel, went to the citizenship office, swore his oath, back on a plane, and he was gone.
What a shame. It's a beautiful place still.
Yeah, none of these guys want to live there, apparently. But they're not interested in archaeology like you and I might be.
Oh my God! There's so much beautiful stuff to find in Malta. We were talking about the food. I went to a couple of restaurants that were extraordinary.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, really. There's one place in Sliema called Takris. It advertises itself as a like your grandmother would do it, like your Maltese grandmother would do it, and the stuff was awesome. The food was extraordinary. It was really like coming to not necessarily to your grandmother, but to your strict auntie who can cook really well, and everything was on point, and it felt good and delicious.
Oh, that's changed a lot. I've heard there's a lot of good restaurants opening now. There wasn't so much when I lived there, but there was a place like that in Marsa Scala where they served Maltese cuisine and really home cooked kind of taste. That was a great spot. We used to go there. It wasn't too far from where the village we lived in, and
the beautiful thing is, it wasn't trying to be fancy or anything. The decor, it was located in an old bakery, but
is it down below, down the stairs? You walk in and you go down.
No. It's in a very small alley in the. I sent you a link later on.
Okay.
So really, this place is awesome. But they were not taking care so much about the decor or anything. It was just a restaurant with great food and a good staff. And in comparison, on the harbor side, where all the tourists go with cocktail bars and happy hour bars, and this was this was also one of those hodgepodges. You found kebabs, sushi, pizza, burgers, but no Maltesian food whatsoever.
Yeah, that's right. The entertainment district, so-called, that Pacheville at the time was the.
Oh, geez, I was there on our
that
last
was a hell.
day. Jesus,
That was horrible even then.
it was like really. We went on our last day just to get a few steps in, and we were walking through this place. This was really. It had one of those. I don't know. I imagine a Russian Las Vegas kind of feel.
Yeah, just drunken binge drinking and
Strip clubs.
Strip clubs, a lot of strip clubs.
A lot of strip clubs.
There's a lot of trafficking in Malta too.
Really?
Human trafficking of girls.
Also.
Massage parlors as well. That's a big. The Shift News did a big investigation into that. That's another unsavory side. Slave labor as well. Actually, that's another story. There was when I lived there was a factory run by Chinese-run factory. They used North Koreans. It was called Leisure Clothing. They were shut down, but North Korean workers, I mean, they're not getting the money that they're paid. That's going back to the to the regime, right? And they don't have their passports. Their passports are kept by the factory owners. That was basically slave labor, and things like that don't happen in Malta without some government crony signing off on it. Like everybody, you don't open a factory without somebody in the government approving it, right? So everybody knows stuff like that happens, and nobody talks about it. But that was one of the unsavory sides of Pacheville too, is this trafficking of girls in especially massage parlors.
Okay.
So that was an area of town I always avoided.
Yeah, you better.
Just for the vomit, the night, like you go, there's people pissing against walls when the bars close,
literally
and puke more vomit per square meter than a maternity ward, I think.
Probably. We were walking through this place pretty early in the morning when the zombies from the last night still walking around. It was crazy. It's really weird.
Oh, it's awful. Yeah, but the compensation of that back then was Valletta. Valletta. Yeah. I think there are more places opening now, and I've heard people complaining about noisy bars and things in Valletta. But back then, that was just magical at night. Like we would go to some photography exhibit or something like this, and we would. My wife was a photographer at that time, and we'd meet up with her teacher or whatever, and we'd go to some little bar in Valletta, some really traditional Maltese place, and have a couple drinks with him, and you'd leave there afterwards, and the whole place is just completely deserted. In the winter, you wouldn't see anybody in Valletta at night. Yeah, we'd walk down to one of those bastions and look out over the harbor, and you could really picture yourself back in the time of the Knights or something. Like it was absolutely magical at night.
Valletta is almost too pretty, I would say, because it looks like I don't know, like a place where a theater is about to happen or some sort of play. It's too much, too beautiful, too unison in the architecture. At night when they switch on the street lights, it's glowing almost from the inside. Amazing place, still.
Yeah, and it's very much lived in. If you walk around and down some of the steps and into some of the side streets and kind of fringy areas, you'd see some more rundown buildings, at least back then. And
yes, there.
People hanging laundry out the window, or people would lower a bucket out the window if they lived on an upper floor.
This is probably imported culture from Sicily.
Yeah, they lower the bucket down for the bread or whatever. The person would send it back up.
Yeah, it's nice. It's very fairy tale-ish, but beautiful place. Good restaurants also, and nice bars. Cool people. The people. Have you experienced when we're talking about we both wouldn't say corrupt government, but let's say questionable government.
Yeah.
The people, on the other hand, the human beings walking around are, in my estimation, among the nicest you can meet.
Yeah, people are incredibly nice. I lived in a lot of different places. Like some of the villages felt like very closed places. It took a bit longer to get to know people there.
Obviously, you're the stranger.
Yeah, well, I mean, I knew I had a neighbor from Slima who moved to this village too, and he said he's lived there 5 years, and he's always the guy from Slima. So
Yeah,
I mean,
probably be
I'm
that
from a small
forever.
town, I get that, but no, people were really very welcoming, especially in those places. I always had very good neighbors, and I was lucky I had very good landlords as
Hmm.
well, which is not very common from the stories I hear from other people. We always got along really well with the three places we rented.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah, really, really great people.
Yeah, I figured. I walking around, especially from Valletta, like back to Sliema, taking the long way around the harbor, I noticed some graffitis. That
Oh yeah.
I noticed some graffiti, and especially there's one claim coming up again and again: justice for Daphne.
Hmm.
Can you explain what that means?
She was a journalist who was killed in a massive car bomb in 2017.
A car bombing.
A huge one, yeah.
Okay.
There have been car bombs were fairly common up until then. Well, I mean, so at the time I lived there, I was there 6 years, and I think there were 8. I'd have to check my book, but there were 8 car bombings just in the time that we were there, always in broad daylight and commuter traffic. And at that time, it usually had to do with the smugglers or some underworld dispute.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some big ones too, but this was the first targeted political murder since the 80s. So she was an investigative journalist. She was Malta's most widely read newspaper columnist. And by the time the big political crisis hit with the Panama Papers and all this corruption started coming out under the government of Joseph Muscat, the prime minister I told you about, who came in and started selling passports and that. By the time that struck her, she had a blog called Running Commentary.
Mm-hmm.
She started it to give herself more freedom to publish whatever she wanted multiple times a day, compared to a weekly newspaper column.
She was an avid writer.
Yeah, she wrote multiple times a day, usually late at night, and she was exposing all of this corruption. She was getting more traffic than all the island's newspapers put together. So like everybody went to her
knew
site.
her.
Oh yeah, she was seen by the time this big political crisis struck. She was seen as the only opposition in the country. The opposition party was quite fractured, and some said compromised by the Labour government.
Mm-hmm.
And so her face was on billboards during the election. And Joseph Muscat, the prime minister, said, "Yeah, if you want to see who's bad mouthing the country or giving us a bad reputation abroad, why don't you go to Bidnia, which is where she lived." So she kept exposing all these massive corruption stories involving top government officials, including the prime minister and his inner circle. And she was working on an investigation of this electric gas power station, a massive public-private partnership, when she was killed. She'd received nobody knew it at the time, but she had received a massive data leak from an insider at Electric Gas. And she was working through all of that and was kind of getting ready to publish the results for investigation. She was she got in her car one morning. She was on her way to the bank because her bank accounts were frozen by the economy minister who was suing her. So it's a bit of a convoluted story, but but at the time she died, she had, I forget how many, 40 some lawsuits against her, most of them from politicians. Because libel suits are a way to kick the can down the road in Malta. So if you're accused of something, in this case, the economy minister, when Malta was holding the rotating presidency of the European Union, he was in Germany on business, and he was seen in a brothel with his assistant having a threesome with a prostitute. And some Maltese happened to be there and saw it and sent Daphne the picture because she had this great network.
Yeah.
So she mentioned this on her blog, and he sued her for libel because rather than have to explain yourself, they say, "Oh, we'll see you in court." She said, "Okay, I want to summon your phone records," because that would show exactly where you were. So he panicked, and this dragged on for months. But anyway, he the economy minister put the hammer of the law onto her and garnished her bank account for it was like something like 70,000 euros.
Mm-hmm.
So just tried to financially cripple her, because if you don't defend these libel suits, it's a slap suit, basically. It's
Gotcha.
been big news in the European Union recently, but her followers crowdfunded the amount, and she was okay. But by the next day, they raised that amount of money and more.
Really?
So she was on the way to the bank to her husband's account to get some money out, because hers was frozen. Got into her car, forgot her checkbook, went back into her house, put some tomatoes down in front of her son and said, okay, I'll see you later. Drove away, and he heard this massive explosion, and he ran out the door, smoke in the distance, and he said he knew exactly what it was when he heard it. And there were just pieces of body parts scattered all over the road. The burning shell of a car in a field. I mean, and probably one of the worst things about this, the photos of the crime scene were circulated online within hours, obviously taken by police and leaked out. And people were celebrating her death in closed Labour Party social media groups, including high-ranking government officials. The Shift News infiltrated these groups. You can see these posts and what they were saying online. She can't even burn in hell because she's in so many pieces and all this kind of stuff. Like, half the population despised her because she exposed all this corruption in the Labour Party, and so many people were benefiting from it. And then half secretly revered her, but they were too scared to say they read her. So you would see somebody in a grocery store, I'd see somebody I knew, and they'd kind of look around and whisper and say, "Are you reading Daphne?" And they don't.
Yeah.
Like the population was quite scared of repercussions and revenge, vague forms of revenge. So basically, she was the main opposition in the country, and when she was silenced, it was done with a massive car bomb to send a message.
And did this message get received? No opposition to the government until today from then on?
It did spark the growth of a civil society movements in Malta that you didn't see up until that point. Also, a friend of Daphne who was managing editor of the Times of Malta for quite a number of years, a woman called Ryan Muscat, no relation to the Prime Minister.
Mm-hmm.
She started an investigative news outlet called The Shift to carry on Daphne's work. They've been publishing some amazing investigations. I was a columnist there for several years.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah.
And they did spark some civil society and protest movements. In particular, several years passed, nothing was done. The hitmen who planted the bomb in her car were arrested fairly quickly. That's because one of the higher ups in the security service called in the Americans and Dutch experts for help in tracing, the phone signals that triggered the bomb. And then he told his superiors what he'd done. So they had no choice but to track these people down.
Sure.
And they were arrested fairly quickly. All the car bombs stopped all of a sudden. There hadn't been any. I don't think there's been any since then. So, I mean, everybody knew who was doing it. These two bottom-feeding hitmen, these brothers who lived, collecting welfare while driving, luxury cars, sending their kids to private schools, gambling in casinos. They were living well beyond their means, but nobody questioned it. Those guys were arrested, and they clammed up and said nothing. And the government tried to treat this, as case closed, and we got the people who did this, and that's it. But years and years went on.
So, excuse me, and no one asked these two brothers, these car bombing murderers, why did you do this? Or
they didn't talk. They said nothing for, I think, 5 years, and then they finally went on a podcast. And one of them went on a podcast with Stephen Gray from Reuters, and just
what?
Yeah, they were. So the trial, they were in custody. The trial dragged on. It was 5 years. The trial hadn't even started. They have this thing in Malta called compilation of evidence. This procedure in court cases where they go and gather all the evidence and decide then if they're going to press charges. This dragged on and on and on because the lawyers keep raising objections and pretrial objections of all different types to run the clock out. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, the government, including the chief of staff of the prime minister, all these well-connected guys who were implicated in this electric gas power station scandal, did everything they could to derail the investigation. details of the investigation, the police investigation, were leaked to the people suspected of commissioning the murder. Like they did everything they could to stop it. The police commissioner wouldn't investigate any of the corruption because he's appointed by the Prime Minister. The Attorney General refused to prosecute. They wouldn't investigate the Panama Papers. They did nothing, basically, in the hopes that they could just brush this all under the rug with the rest of these hitmen. And then in 2019, late 2019, the middleman who commissioned this assassination was arrested. He was a loan shark. He was involved in, money laundering, loan sharking kind of schemes. But Interpol knew he was involved in so much more than that, and they suspected he was involved in this. The Maltese police were dragging their heels, refused to arrest this guy. They were going to arrest him on tax evasion charges. But he was tipped off that they were coming and said, make sure the place is totally clean when they get here. And don't worry, Ray will be there. You'll be okay with Ray. Ray Aquilina, the head of the Economic Crimes Unit, was going to be the guy searching this guy's house and make sure they don't find anything. But the Interpol jumped a couple days early and arrested this guy. And when he was arrested, he was clutching an ice cream container that had USB drives in it, a picture of him with the chief of staff of the Prime Minister, and USB drives with conversations between him and the man he drove for. He was also the chauffeur of a businessman called Jürgen Fennick. That one big tower by Pocheville, he owns that.
Yeah.
As well as a bunch of casinos, the Hilton Hotel, all these things. His family owns that. When this guy, this middleman, Melvin Thuma, was arrested, he started to panic. And everybody sat on it for about a week. The news media knew who he had named as the person alleged to have commissioned this assassination, but nobody was mentioning it. The government was doing nothing. So the Times of Malta leaked out that it was a prominent local businessman. That night, sure enough, this guy tried to run away in his yacht. He was intercepted off the coast, trying to sneak off to Sicily and arrested. Really? When that happened, all hell broke loose. Like then people protested and they realized everything Daphne wrote about is proving to be true. This guy was the richest businessman on the island. He was also a key player in this electric gas investigation, and the owner of a secret Dubai company that was connected to the Panama Papers companies owned by the energy minister and the chief of staff, and a third company whose owner was so secretive they would only mention it over Skype. So this guy was alleged to be the mastermind. When he was arrested, there were massive protests broke out. It lasted about a month. I thought it was the end. Like Valletta was packed with people every single night. And you don't see this in Malta, this kind of protest, because people are quite fearful. It ended up, Joseph Muscat had to resign at that point. He drove him from power. They got rid of the economy minister, or the energy minister, the guy in the Panama Papers, finally had to resign. His chief of staff was arrested and questioned about this murder and let go the same night. So like all these big players started to fall. They had to have an election or a leadership contest, and Joseph Muscat made sure that his handpicked successor, a guy who was his lawyer, became prime minister. And that's it. No action's been taken ever since. This Jürgen Fennick was arrested. He was kept in pretrial custody for 5 years. The trial hadn't started yet, and they just let him out of jail about a week and a half ago on bail. So he's walking around.
A week ago from today?
Yeah, just recently, like a week ago, week and a half ago.
Okay.
So basically, the two hitmen, they were convicted. They got 40 years each, these brothers, because they confessed, because he blurted it out on a podcast. Yeah. The middleman in the assassination got the guy who was the go-between between this businessman and the hitman. He got a complete pardon for turning witness. There was a third hitman that was sort of the lookout guy for the two brothers. He cut a deal to testify against the others, and he got away with 15 years. These guys are involved in tons of different crimes too. So basically the only people that were punished were the hitmen. No politicians have been investigated.
No politicians have been harmed during this investigation.
There recently charges were filed in a scandal involving hospitals, public hospitals, that these same guys were all involved in. And Joseph Muscat was charged with corruption and money laundering and a number of things. But I mean, that's One last thing. I know
Yeah,
this is
please.
really complicated, and people should just. I wrote a whole book about this to try to piece together just a couple of the threads. But
Called A Sunny Place for Shady People. Great title, by
Right.
the way.
That came from Somerset Maugham. He said that about Monaco. So all those investigations, I said that Joseph Muscat was charged with corruption in this hospital deal, and there's been some other charges related to money laundering and passport sales and kickbacks, alleged kickbacks. All of those investigations happened because citizens could request a magisterial inquiry into these things. So a magisterial inquiry is just a compilation of evidence conducted by a magistrate or a judge. Because the police just wouldn't act on any of these corruption cases, and because the Attorney General refused to prosecute any of them, they were seen as totally compromised. But when the news media like The Shift and the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation and the Times of Malta and these others continue to investigate these stories, you'd see civil society groups or a lawyer, an opposition lawyer, requesting magisterial inquiries into them, and the judge would investigate them, and they could refer charges. And that's why this hospital's investigation happened. That's why 2 or 3 of the other ones happened that now resulted in charges against some of these guys. The government currently is trying to ram through legislation to make it impossible for people to, average citizens, to just go in and request these investigations. They want to close that loophole so that you have to go to the police. You can't just request these things. And if the police don't take action for a year, then you can request them. So the one thing
They're buying time.
No, well, not just that, but they want to apply, if they're trying to ram through this law right now as we speak, and they want to apply it retroactively. So any investigation that's been going on for 2 years or more will just stop. And that includes all of these things that are linked to investigations that Daphne was conducting. So basically, the Maltese government now is trying to protect Joseph Muscat, the former prime minister, and his inner circle by changing the law to make sure that the last investigative outlet that was still, uncompromised and not answerable to the prime minister will be closed. And not only will that option close for people, the current investigations will all be killed. They'll be done. So the government itself is basically captured by organized crime.
Apart from capturing the brothers and the middleman, there's the file would be closed, the case would be dead, and nothing good will come from this. No,
it's just the last sort of capture of the last remaining institutions that could bring any justice.
Until you had to transfer the whole thing into the present, this really sounded to me like a very good, like European-made crime series. I imagine like 2 to 3 seasons, good actors, good actresses, with a happy ending when the people all protest in the street of Valletta. Imagine those pictures would be awesome. But now you're telling me there's no happy ending in Malta nowadays.
I don't think there will be. I mean, I lived there for 6 years. I spent 3-4 years writing that book. I've written 400 articles probably for the newspaper down there. I mean, I wrote about those trials, the horrible details of these trials when they're compiling evidence against the hitman, and what they said to each other, how they planned it. It's pretty awful. I didn't know her personally, but I exchanged emails with her, maybe 8 or 10 emails, and I wrote for her website a few times. So, I felt a bit of a personal connection with this woman, and really respected her writing and admired what she was doing. So it was pretty awful to write about some of that stuff. And seeing what I've seen from digging so deeply into all of it, I don't think there's any happy ending here. I think the hitmen will do their time. If they talk, or if there's any risk of them talking, I suspect they'll die in prison. Yeah. And I think everybody else will walk away. I'm sorry to have to say that, but I think that I don't see Jürgen Fenech getting off on bail now because they ran out the clock. I don't think he'll see another day in prison because he just knows too much. He knows too much about too many powerful people. And he said when he was arrested, if I go down, they all go down with me, or everybody goes down with me.
He really said that?
Yeah, the police, some of the stuff that ends up, I don't think they were able to admit in court what he said when he was arrested, but all these things came out in the compilation of evidence. When he was arrested, they got his phone, and the WhatsApp messages on his phone, you hear there's messages from his uncle and brother saying, go now, like they're go to France, use your boat, go to France, and then don't fly and don't use your credit card, like get out now. The night he was arrested, he was sending messages to a guy called Keith Schembri, who was the Prime Minister's chief of staff, one of the people named in the Panama Papers. He was sending WhatsApp messages saying, are they coming today?
Yeah.
Meaning, obviously, the police. And, Keith said, no. The night that he was arrested, the night that he cut and ran in his yacht, the last phone conversation he had, a 20-minute call, was with Keith Schembri, the chief of staff of the Prime Minister. These guys were all childhood friends. So
it's a small island.
So the details of the investigations were being leaked to him. The bomb makers also, actually, I forgot to mention them. They were charged. They're out on bail, walking around. The guys that allegedly procured the bomb. They found, when Fenech was arrested, they also found on his phone a security service, like the spy service, dossier on these bomb makers. So who gave him that? It had to come from the highest levels of government. So the connections are so twisted and deep between this inner circle, this power station scandal, and these other corruption cases, and these key players, and the institutions are all captured. So, judging by what I've seen from Maltese court cases, they'll drag it on for as many years as they can. A lot of the stuff will eventually be time barred because it just took too long. So now, they can't charge these guys anymore. It just took too long. And if it does look like there's any real risk of convictions, I think you'll just see some deliberate fuck up where there's some technicality gets screwed up and it ends up just being thrown out. That I saw that happen quite often with minor cases, or evidence goes missing.
Yeah, of course. The technicalities that get in the way, it's always very frustrating. What are we making out of all of this? I mean, you're living in the EU for quite some time now, and looking to America and looking around. I still think that Europe is a good idea. Now, there are obviously some foul apples in the basket of Europe. So what are we making of this? What does this say about Europe, the European Union?
I think there was a lot of naivety involved in setting up the European Union, because they have lots of mechanisms for bringing in other countries, but they didn't have a mechanism for kicking anybody out or punishing them when they don't fulfill their part of the bargain. Like you're seeing rule of law problems with various countries in Europe now, typically Eastern Europe. Hungary always comes up as a place that's always running afoul of Brussels.
Yeah.
Malta's the same, and they've sent so many commissions down there to write reports on the rule of law in Malta, always coming back like shocked, pale white, shocked at what they've seen. And they shake their finger and scold them, and nothing ever. They say, yes, we'll change those laws, and they don't change anything. And
that's it.
And that's it. They don't seem able to do anything about it because there's no legal mechanism for them to.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And there's no mechanism for saying, okay, then if you're not going to toe the line and fulfill your obligations, out you go. We'll kick you out. There's nothing. There's no mechanism for that whatsoever. So when they formed this group, it was a great idea. But I think there probably should have been nobody imagined, I think, at the time that anybody would be so low as to sell citizenship out the back door so you can go and live in somebody else's country, whether those people liked it or not. Nobody imagined, I think, that advantage would be taken like this in the way that the current government of Malta has been taking advantage. That the previous government under Gonzi was, I think, quite admirable in many ways. By the time they lost power, they were lazy, and there was a few minor corruption scandals, but they were dealt with. Whereas under Joseph Muscat's government, they were getting caught was not a disgrace. It was just bad luck.
He was really putting corruption to work.
Yeah, they came in with a roadmap. It's obvious when you look at everything. Yeah. The sequence of events that I lay out in my book and everything that happened there, they came in with a roadmap. They had these Panama companies ready to go. if this power station project got approved, and they made sure it would get approved by stacking the advisory board.
He came prepared, you say?
Well, I mean, it's not easy to open these offshore companies. Like, there's a lot of documents, a lot of notarized documents, references, proof of source of funds. If you're political, you're pretty toxic because it's obvious the risk. So nobody wants to open these accounts for you. So all these documents were prepared. And then when they were elected to power, then they started the process of opening the companies, like within weeks. The energy minister, the chief of staff, and a third company, whose shelf company, whose owner was so sensitive that they would only name it over Skype, not an email. So that doesn't show up in the data leak. Daphne alleged that it was that third company was owned by Joseph Muscat's wife. And she claimed that the copy of the registry was kept in this Pilatus Bank. Pilatus Bank was, they were unable to open bank accounts for their secret companies. Nobody would take them. So they just approved a bank run by a 34-year-old Iranian banker with no prior banking experience. Came to Malta and opened a bank. Yeah.
Really?
That was another big scandal. When he was finally arrested in the States, the European Central Bank shut them down, but Malta refused to do anything about it. So they had a very dodgy bank that was the result. There's another investigation on that if you look it up. I wrote about that as well. So it's just a backdoor into Europe for so much.
Just to make sure I got this right, no bank would take them, so they set a bank up run by someone they found.
This guy showed up and wanted a banking license, and
they gave it to
Malta,
him.
and he got it in record time. I forget the exact. It's in my book, the exact timeline, but the records, the Panama Papers leak up to the time that these hard drive was raided or whatever for these documents, it showed that they tried to open bank accounts in multiple jurisdictions. When they were caught, the energy minister was caught with this Panama company. He said, well, it was just for asset management, and he didn't own anything except a rundown, rental house in London. And then he said, he always believed in transparency. He had ticked boxes on his application form. You can see it. It says no audit and keep it secret. And he said, well, yeah, okay, I had this company, but I didn't do anything with it. There's no money. There's no bank account. But it wasn't for lack of trying. Like, this is like you catch a thief in your living room. And he said, yeah, okay, I broke in, but I haven't taken anything yet. So what's the problem,
You should really lock your doors, man.
So all that stuff came out, and it caused such a scandal that they had a snap election. And Joseph Muscat, you think that, there were rallies and stuff protesting against this. This Panama Papers thing really shook the country up and called a snap election. And no, this was after, it was after the Daphne alleged that the third Panama company was owned by Muscat's wife. He called a snap election because things were kind of turning against him. He was elected with an even larger majority. So when confronted with all this documented evidence of corruption, the Panama Papers leak had scans of people's passports, their application forms, their signature. It's not allegations.
Yeah.
People voted in favor of it. Basically, he got a bigger majority. They voted in favor of corruption. There was a foreign journalist was on the island at that time, and I remember the story. He asked his taxi driver what he thought about the whole thing, and the guy said, "Yeah, maybe they took something, but they didn't take it from me, so I don't care. I'm making more money now, and I got a better job. So, why shouldn't they take their cut?" Basically,
I lately read a book, a German book called, if I loosely translated, "Too Stupid for Democracy?" by the journalist Mark Schieritz, and it begs the question: Are we the people too stupid for democracy? Do we know what it means to be a Democrat, not in the US kind of way, but a participating, human being in this political field? And if I, as a European, look to the US, where Donald Trump just got reelected, I tend to think, yeah, maybe. And then I look at the parties coming up in Germany, raising power. It's not only that I don't like those, but the policies that they are about to implement if they are in power, they are to the disadvantage of the people who elect them. And this is the point where I'm running to a wall. Like, okay, what's then to do? What if the turkeys are choosing Christmas or what? What is to do, Ryan?
I don't have any answers. My country elected Justin Trudeau 3 times. So, I mean, if that's just more proof of your point, really. If people were foolish enough to elect a guy whose only previous job experience was part-time drama teacher because he has a famous name and he's pretty,
He's
that
really
doesn't
pretty.
say much.
He's a pretty guy.
Yeah, disastrous. I barely recognize the place when I go home these days. It's in such bad shape. Yeah. But I mean, there's a guy who liberal, progressive, lots of on social issues, but he was protested against at one point a couple of years ago, and they froze people's bank accounts, brought in what used to be called the War Measures Act.
Wait a second. In Canada?
Yes, yeah. That was big news a couple of years ago. It was during COVID. Some truckers were protesting about mandatory vaccinations or something, and they drove all across the country to get to Ottawa, and they camped out in front of the Parliament buildings.
Yeah.
And they stayed too long. They stayed longer than they should have. But they had bouncy castles, and they were playing, street hockey and stuff. Like it was just like a big street party by the looks of it. But all they wanted was to be heard, Like if this guy would have just gone out and talked to them, said, "What are you guys so upset about?" I think that could have been dissolved quite easily, but instead, Trudeau came down with COVID and had to go into self-isolation, which happens quite regularly whenever there's a crisis. I guess his immune system collapsed or something each time, and he always had to go into hiding. But he basically, there was something called the War Measures Act in the 70s. These powers were abused because of Quebec separatism. There were a couple bombings on the streets in the 70s in Canada, and Quebec separatism was quite a big thing. And the government alleged that there was this huge terrorist conspiracy and passed this War Measures Act, and there were tanks in the streets of Ottawa and stuff. Funny enough, the leader at that time was Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father.
Really?
Basically powers were abused at that time, and the law was changed to what they call the Emergencies Act now, and it was made very strict. Strictly limiting the government's powers in these cases to prevent those kinds of abuses again. These protesters who were protesting against Trudeau's policies were camped out in Ottawa, and they stayed too long and they wouldn't go. But rather than just get the police to come and clear them out, he put these emergency powers into place. They froze people's bank accounts. Anybody who donated to this, even $10, were coming under the microscope of the police. They trampled people with horses, for Christ's sake. Like the RCMP came flooding in with horses. There's videos of people old people being trampled on the streets in Ottawa.
The friendly Canadians?
I lived in Ottawa for 10 years. I mean, I couldn't believe that. But anyway, the government could use these powers for about a week, and then they had to go to a vote in Parliament whether to implement them or not. But basically, they came into force right away as soon as they declared it. Right before the vote was going to happen, and they knew they were going to lose it, they said, "Okay, we don't need them anymore. We've cleared everything up." And so basically they used the powers illegally. An inquiry later found that they used them illegally, and nothing happened. He was reelected after that. So, I mean, it just goes to show you people are foolish enough to keep reelecting somebody like this who claims to be liberal and claims to be so progressive. And when he runs into opposition, they were passing internet censorship bills that were quite chilling as well. Like it's...
So, and you were in Ottawa at the time?
No, I was here.
Okay.
In Berlin. No, I lived in Ottawa as a student for about 10 years.
Ah, okay. Otherwise, I would have suspected that it's probably something to do with you when you were in Ottawa and there was riots, then you're in Malta and there's all this fuck up, and now you're here in Germany and we got the election.
Nothing happened in Japan when I lived there, I don't think.
I think people might imagine that they know all the shady business that is going on in their country, probably. And then they look to other countries quite hopeful that it's like the promised land and everyone there is nice, like Canada. And if you look close enough, like you, Ryan, did, there's like everyone has dirt on their hands. Pretty much everyone. And
Yeah.
maybe that's just how it is, and this is how we have to deal with it. But I'm missing a little bit something like best practices,
Well, we've entered some very strange times, but I think it's just a return to history, really.
What
Like,
do
I
you
think
mean?
the time period that we lived in from the end of the Cold War, like I grew up in the I was born in the 70s. I grew up in the 80s.
Yeah,
During the height of the Cold War, at a time when it really seemed like the missiles could be flying at any point. And I remember I was scared in bed at night as a kid, worrying about this. And then it all ended, and the wall came down just across town here. And
sure.
it seemed like such a promising time. That
The
period
end of
between,
history.
yeah, the end of history. Yeah, that's how prescient that turned out to be.
Yeah, right.
But that period between then and maybe 9/11, but things started to change then. But I think really COVID was the marker. 2019, from about 89 to 2019, we lived in a very strange period of peace. Or if you count the post-war years right through the Cold War, that was a sort of peace with proxy wars everywhere.
Yeah.
I think that was an anomaly. I think this period, especially since the end of the Cold War till now, was a very unusual, unbroken period of relative peace in the world. And I think we're just back to the same
normal.
great power politics that was always.
Yeah.
I mean, we have some. At least I'm not sure how old you are, but I have some sense of it, having lived at the tail end of the Cold War and remembering it very well.
I'm born 1980, so I remember when the wall came down as a child, and that is an interesting idea, that until COVID, everything seemed kind of peaceful, promising, and it was like a hey, we won feeling.
Yeah.
We did it, and we did not.
No, it didn't last. No. Well, there's a geopolitical strategist called Peter Zion. He writes about this, and his most recent book was what was it? The beginning. I can't remember the title offhand. Something about the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning, or something like this.
Yeah. Rings a
it's
bell.
a very interesting book, but he said that 2019 is we'll look back at that as the peak. That's the best we've ever had it, and the best we ever will have it. And everything from here is going downhill because of declining populations in so many Western countries. According to him, will cause sort of a collapse in the globalized model that we've been living under for so long. That, combined with America pulling back and refusing to police the sea lanes, which made quite a lot of globalization possible, and this sort of just-in-time manufacturing and all that sort of stuff, that starts to collapse because with declining populations in the West, there's not enough consumer base to carry it all.
Yeah.
And with the U.S. turning inwards and being unwilling to, because there's no incentive for them anymore to, they don't need oil from Saudi Arabia anymore. They're self-sufficient between fracking and oil from Alberta in Canada. So them in the post-war period, that the U.S. policing the sea lanes, for example, and keeping the world open to trade, if that comes to an end, then it sort of becomes a scramble for resources. So he sees the end of globalization will mean a lot more reshoring, higher prices for everybody, a lot more insularity, and power blocks sort of shaping up as we're seeing now.
Yeah.
Like, we see some of the scramble happening with the war just over the border in Ukraine.
Yeah, sure.
Resource scrambles on the part of China and countries like this.
Resource scrambles on the part of the U.S., who always is to use this ungodly word, to make a deal with the Ukraine, where they don't want to have anyone from the Ukraine sitting on the table while this deal has been made, or has been made. Yeah. Malta is still a funny place to visit. Would you go there again?
Not after writing that book, probably not. No, but I was, after spending 6 years there, I didn't want to go back very badly, especially after what happened to Daphne. It left a pretty bad taste in my mouth when I saw how she stood alone against all this corruption. Nobody was brave enough to stand up with her. She was isolated, and then she could be killed. And that really pissed me off. Like I had a lot of respect for her, and I really regret not having met her in person. So um, I kind of wrote the whole place off at that point in my mind until I met Caroline Muscat, the publisher of the Shift News,
Yeah.
for dinner once in Berlin, and she sort of pulled me in as a columnist, and I got exposed to a lot of people I would have never otherwise met there, like these activists, these journalists who were kind of fighting back against it. That changed my opinion a fair bit, and she did lure me back there once for meetings. But probably I'm not likely to visit again. I don't think. I'd rather remember the place that I knew in those early years.
Gotcha.
The village I lived in, the old house I lived in, the people I knew. I don't want to see these skyscrapers that tarnish the landscape and the overbuilding and stuff. I think I'd rather remember the place I knew when it still had some of the magic that the old people told me about.
I can see that. Yeah. So, if there would be a place that you can travel next or live next, what would it be?
I think we're likely to move back to Japan next year.
Really?
Yeah, that's that's most. My wife's parents are getting older, and
Got you. So your wife is from Japan.
yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, so I think we're probably going to move back there. So this year I'm trying to do a lot of I'm hoping to do a lot of travel to hit a few hidden corners I haven't seen yet in Europe. There's still
You should
I mean it's endless. There's so many places.
definitely. You should definitely go to the Basque country.
That's beautiful there. Yeah, I was there a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and it's I think you would like it because it's pretty political. They got their own struggles down there, and I was talking to a gentleman from also journalist from an online outlet. They're also there in the beautiful Basque country of northern Spain. There's fuckery going on, of course.
Yeah, always. Yeah, yeah. I'm headed back there this summer actually.
Yeah.
I want to hike the Pyrenees, the whole thing, from Atlantic to. I've been buying up maps and stuff and planning that now. But I've got interested in Central Asia as well. I was in Uzbekistan a year or so ago. That always appealed to me. The Great Game and all that stuff. Have you come across those books by Peter Hopkirk?
No, I don't
Oh
know.
write that down. They're amazing.
The Great Game?
Yeah, it was the struggle for territorial dominance between British India and imperialist Russia, Tsarist Russia.
Okay.
And this buffer zone of Central Asia at that time, where the Khanate of Bukhara and Khiva and these places were basically seldom or almost unvisited by outsiders. They were controlled by these kind of raving maniac khans and emirs. And the Great Game is sort of the story of these two great powers spying on each other in this buffer zone and trying to secretly map the territory. So Rudyard Kipling's Kim is about this, the novel. Yeah. They were sending out these pundits, disguised as holy men with prayer wheels. Inside their prayer wheels would be not prayers but their notes, and they'd have hidden thermometers up their sleeve to calculate altitude, and they'd be mapping their footsteps and secretly mapping these.
Don't spill the beans. If you're interested in the history of places, are you familiar with the podcast Conflicted?
Yes, yeah, that's great,
isn't it? Really, good.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
No, Eamon Dean's a really interesting character. He reminds me of a Lebanese guy I knew in Ottawa because he's got the exact same sense of humor.
Yeah.
Those terrible jokes and the same chuckle and stuff. So I get flashbacks when I hear that. But really, really interesting podcast.
Yeah, it's really good. Very recommendable. You have a podcast of your own. Inner Landscapes, right?
Personal landscapes. Yeah.
Inner Landscapes sounds a little bit too woo-woo. Also,
yeah, that sounds like psychedelic.
Psychedelic or doing yoga or breathing exercises. So,
personal landscapes. I talk to writers, often writers of travel books, but also historians, a couple novelists, books about place, basically.
Okay, cool.
So a bit broader than travel. Yeah. I've got some. I've talked to some cool writers.
I listened to a couple of episodes. I like it. It's really good. I will put that in the show notes. Ryan, thank you so much for the time. It was a pleasure talking to you, even though that the topics we were talking about were not that pleasurable. But what you're gonna do? You gotta face the world around you, right?
No, thank you. Thank you for asking me, and I hope you make it back to Malta. It's a fascinating place. Like there's so much happening below the surface there. So the longer you stay, the more you'll see.
I will take that to heart. Thank you. Und wir sind raus. Ladies and Gentlemen, ich bedanke mich fürs Einschalten, Zuhören und Dranbleiben in der Hoffnung, dass eure Zeit hier gut investiert war. Bitte vergesst nicht, Natürliche Ausrede in der Podcast-App eurer Wahl zu abonnieren. Und wenn ihr das Ding unterstützen wollt, geht das über PayPal oder im Abo bei Steady. Mich würde das sehr freuen, die Links dazu in den Shownotes. Und wenn Mundpropaganda eher euer Ding ist, der Typ, von dem ihr wahrscheinlich bald eine Kippe schnorren werdet, sollte diesen Podcast unbedingt kennenlernen. Wir hören uns nächsten Montag wieder, dann kommt ein altbekannter Gast zurück. Was immer ihr tut, macht's gut. Bis später.